The video game landscape is pretty darn enormous already, and it continues to grow every year, so it makes sense some landmark series and franchises have felt the need to change things up over the decades. Not all these changes made things better, mind you, but we've collected 10 instances where game studios decided to throw out the rulebook on their wildly popular franchises and try something completely different. Even in the occasions where the critical or fan reaction wasn't overwhelmingly positive, there's always something to appreciate about watching publishers and developers dare to be different. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video game entries that drastically changed the formula. Number 10, Fallout 3. Whether the Fallout series got better or worse when the formula changed with the release of Fallout 3 is divisive, but one thing we can all agree on is that it's certainly different. Prior to Fallout 3, the first two games were an isometric RPG, and while the game certainly retained its RPG roots, at least for the two Bethesda games to come, the style changed drastically. When the original developers Black Isle Studios folded, the reins were passed to Bethesda, and with that change came a switch to first-person perspective and the abandonment of the series' turn-based combat. The VATS combat system remained, but it was now built into real-time combat engagement. Despite the big change, Fallout 3 was incredibly successful, probably because despite the changes, this title and New Vegas proved that the soul of the series was still very much intact. Number 9, Resident Evil 4. Like Fallout, the Resident Evil franchise has gone through a few major changes, some for the better and some for the Resident Evil 6. While there are a number of fundamental changes we could point to in the franchise's history, we're gonna go with a positive formula switch up, and that came with Resident Evil 4. This entry is commonly accepted to be the perfect Resi game, and while the subsequent games were anything but bad, Resi 4 had a special kind of magic. This magic was generated through a specific blend that combined the best elements of survival horror, action, and adventure gaming. While Resident Evil 7 would come along to shake things up all over again years later, you can't discount the impact of Resi 4 dropping the old school isometric view and refocusing on epic set pieces and pivotal narrative moments, while retaining the survival horror dread and intense feeling of vulnerability. Number 8, Mass Effect Andromeda. Despite popular opinion, not everything that Andromeda changed about Mass Effect was a bad thing. Only almost everything that Andromeda changed about Mass Effect was bad. Remember the combat and movement mechanics? Those were pretty good. Of course you don't, because everything else was so disappointing nobody really got into this thing, past realizing it was very much not the Mass Effect game they were looking for. Aside from the more fluid combat, the world felt so much smaller, your companions were far less charismatic, and it appeared like Andromeda had just lost that quintessential Mass Effect magic. The far less inspiring game world, lack of alien races, and bland lore stripped most of the strengths that fans loved from the original trilogy. Andromeda also traded the class system for a profile swapping mechanic, which some were a fan of, but again, most couldn't get past all the newest entry lacked. Number 7, Assassin's Creed Origins. Unlike a lot of the entries on this list, Assassin's Creed didn't change as a result of one entry. It slowly adopted different genre stylings before flipping into a new genre over the course of several entries, but everything got remarkably different with Assassin's Creed Origins. This is the entry where all of Assassin's Creed's growing RPG-light tendencies culminated in a true RPG Assassin's Creed game. Whether you love it or hate it is up to you, but it was from this point that the series became synonymous with enormous action RPGs, where you could pretty much be as stealthy or as bombastic as you wanted. The change also kicked off the trend of fully open world maps, crafting, and extensive skill trees. While some long for the days of the classic AC games and begrudge the change in formula, the RPGs have their fans, myself among them, and it was a big change presumably to capitalize on the popularity of enormous scale RPGs. At least it sounds like Ubisoft are promising a return to their roots with their next installment, Assassin's Creed Mirage, so that's a good thing for those who miss when the games had a smaller, more refined focus. Number 6, Shin Megami Tensei Persona 3. Shin Megami Tensei is an institution for JRPG lovers, and it really all kicked off for modern day fans of the Persona games with the 2006 entry Persona 3. Prior to the release of Shin Megami Tensei Persona 3 in 2006, the series was first and foremost a hardcore dungeon crawler. It had the essence of SMT and Persona that fans would come to know and love, but the systems that would become central to the franchise were yet to be introduced. Persona 3 is when things really kicked into gear, and the delicious hybrid genre would really begin to manifest. mixing up mechanics of turn-based combat, role-playing, and social simulation, forming the bedrock of the Persona series that fans adore today. As a result, the unique style and nuances at the franchise's heart remained, but the entire formula was expanded upon. Number 5. Grand Theft Auto 3. Introducing a generation of gamers to a sandbox of mayhem, Grand Theft Auto 3 arrived in 2001 and revolutionized everything. Prior to GTA 3, the series offered up enjoyable automotive chaos, but it was the third installment that set the standard for what the wildly popular series would come to be. Beyond that, it offered players a staggering game world to explore, so many different ways to engage with it, and voice acting and narrative elements that were a huge step above anything fans could have anticipated. From the controls to the detail-rich map and the sheer scope of the game, it's pretty fair to say GTA changed everything, not just for its own franchise, but the gaming landscape as a whole. Number 4. Yakuza Like a Dragon. After many entries telling the epic story of Kazuma Kiryu, Yakuza Like a Dragon took a completely different approach with a new protagonist, a set of new combat mechanics, and perhaps most surprisingly, it all totally worked. Yakuza remained as good after the changes as it was before them. While the combat is usually of the beat-em-up variety, Like a Dragon switched things up to a turn-based system. Similarly, it took an even lighter tone than its predecessors with lovable young protagonist Ichiban Kasuga, and his wild imagination that set the stage for the larger-than-life fights and set pieces. Like a Dragon could easily have been a tricky sell to fans of the original game, but the new entry retained the earnest soul of the early entries, as well as its epic crime narratives, stellar sense of humor, and deeply human stories. Some epic cameos certainly didn't hurt either. Number 3. Syndicate 2012. For the uninitiated, the futuristic sci-fi game Syndicate came onto the scene as an RTS utilizing an isometric perspective, in the vein of something like XCOM. Well, it sure did take its time, but almost 2 whole decades later, the franchise returned for its third entry. But as these things go, the original developer was now out of the picture. Fast forward to 2012, and EA published the Starbreeze Studio-developed entry, also called Syndicate. The game was set prior to the original games and drastically changed up the gameplay formula. Gone was the original set of mechanics in favor of a more traditional first-person shooter, with gameplay consisting largely of shooting sections and hacking puzzles. Clearly they were trying to pull in a bigger audience, but it fell short of the mark. The story left a lot to be desired despite being really strong in the original games, and veteran fans sorely missed the absent strategy elements. Number 2. Star Fox Adventures. When a game doesn't even start as part of the franchise and is instead crammed in and associated with the IP late in development, that should be the tip-off things haven't quite gone to plan. Of course, this one has as many die-hard fans as it does haters, so whichever side of the fence you settle on is totally valid. Star Fox Adventures swaps out the high-octane space-flying action of the original Star Fox games for a more typical action-adventure setup that you'd expect to see in a Zelda game. Though a lot of players missed the central focus on aerial combat and barrel rolls, Adventures curiously decided Fox McCloud's next endeavor would be one of platforming, puzzling, and fighting on the ground. The reason this one seems a little odd is that it was supposed to be a game called Dinosaur Planet that received a Star Fox transplant at Nintendo's request. The game might not have been so divisive if it hadn't been such a stark departure from an already beloved format. All that said, let me know down in the comments if this one worked for you or not. Number 1. Super Mario 64. We'd be extremely remiss to leave out not just one of the greatest series formula change-ups of all time, but one that launched a genre and changed the face of video games. Of course, we're talking about Super Mario 64. Pre-1996, Mario was a 2D kind of guy, but with the arrival of the Nintendo 64, there were more things to explore and ways to explore them than ever before. The 3D playground was a platforming delight, providing a game world ripe with opportunities to explore, hidden secrets, and non-linear engagement. Even though studios were just beginning to find their feet with 3D controls and cameras, Super Mario 64 was and continues to be a slam dunk that will always be one of the most iconic platformers of all time. Of course, this would set the stage for plenty more fantastic 3D Mario games to come, kicking off a whole pile of beloved new favorites. That's the end of our list, but let me know down in that comment box if you can think of any more video game entries that drastically changed the formula. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. You can come say hi to me on my Twitter account if you like, where I'm at Jess McDonald, and make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great gaming content.